my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Irina Bokova, until recently the Director-General of UNESCO. We've been at various events together, and I think the short form of my introduction is that she is a colleague and personal friend, and a colleague and global friend in the whole broad sweep of education and international development. So it is, I'm particularly honored to welcome you to this event today in the Graduate School of Education. At an event that we had yesterday, I was able to say that I was not going to refer to her 12-page single-spaced Wikipedia printout, but I threatened to do so today. And I am going to say a few things about you because I think they need to be said. She is a native of Bulgaria, as many of you know. She was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs in that country. She's been an ambassador to France and to Monaco. She was Bulgaria's permanent delegate to UNESCO, and eventually became Director-General of UNESCO. I believe that was in 2009, the 10th Director-General of UNESCO, and the first female Director of UNESCO. It is difficult, as I said, to summarize all of the different capabilities and achievements of this young woman next to me. I can say that I can vouch for 3 of her 4+ languages, English, French, and Spanish. But I also think there's Russian and maybe Bulgarian on top of that, maybe. I can't judge those things myself. It is interesting, and this might come up a little later on in the conversation, how does a person from a very small state become head of one of the most important organizations in the UN system, and maybe she'll tell us something about that story. She did her first training in Bulgaria and also did international relations at Moscow State Institute, a very well-known site for international relations, both in the former Soviet Union and in Russia today. She did, as far as I can tell, maybe the first connection with the United States in a sense of your education was at the University of Maryland in public affairs in 1989, but eventually also at Harvard University, the Kennedy School of Government, the Executive Program in Leadership, and of course many of you have followed her career as Director General of UNESCO, established really deep and broad relationships with universities in the United States and other institutions as well. And I'm pleased to say I think this is your 3rd visit here to Penn, and or maybe 3rd or 4th, we can't quite remember, 4th, and we are grateful to have you back. She is currently a distinguished fellow in the Perry World House, and we, as the Graduate School of Education, as a member of Perry World House, get to join in welcoming her here today. There are so many pages here. I wanted just to list, because I don't get a chance to do this, there's 2 pages of honorary awards, and I won't mention all of them, but they're impressive enough that I thought it would be useful to mention a few of them. So she has a Doctor Honoris at least, on page 1, at least 15 different universities. I think that's a record by Penn standards in any case. From Algiers to Dhaka to Edinburgh to San Tomas, Philippine Normal University, just to mention a few on page 1. And then it goes to page 2, and then it goes to page 3. So if you accumulate them, that's a lot of years of study. If you really had it, if they weren't honorable, you would have spent your whole life getting your doctorate. So very impressive. And I know from personal experience, and this just gives a number of the references of her speeches and publications, is also equally impressive. On a professional side, I had the opportunity to meet Madame Bokova shortly after she became Director General at UNESCO. And I think we must have met maybe dozens of times at different conferences in different places, and to hear her speak almost in every occasion, eloquently, brilliantly, often without notes, and often on topics so diverse that it could cover most of the departments here at the University of Pennsylvania. This is a person who can cover many different areas with a level of credibility and sincerity that is really almost unmatched in the international space. So, and I know I'm probably going on and I don't want to embarrass you with all this, yes, but it's important to say that UNESCO has been very fortunate to have her as a leader these last 8 years, and of course we are very fortunate to have you with us. I want to say also on a sort of University of Pennsylvania note that during her tenure as Director General, we have been very fortunate as a program. Many of you are with the International Educational Development Program and have had friends, colleagues, maybe yourselves have been able to go to UNESCO or UNESCO offices in different parts of the world. The fact that UNESCO continues to do this is, at least in part, due. It started before Irina Bokova came to UNESCO, but it certainly has taken off with your interest in forming partnerships with universities and partnerships with students and caring about the future. This we are very appreciative of. We are very hopeful that this will continue, and we are counting on it, and we are counting on, of course, working with you on your next set of adventures, which we may talk about a little later on. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to, so this conversation will be, I'm going to ask Madame Bokova to say first a few words about her own personal history. How did she become Director General? It wasn't a straight line, never is. Then to speak on the topic of the day, which is around education, UNESCO, and the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the past, looking forward. We'll take about somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes for that. Then we'll open it up to questions and answers, and we'll try to end around 3:30-ish. And now, Cece, we have to mic.
Do I need this?
I think so, because we want to get you on the video. So let's give it, while this is happening. Well, thank you.
The other side. Sorry. Yeah, like that. Okay, let me just move. Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dan, for this very kind and quite embarrassing introduction. And to embarrass me in front of these young people was not very fair, but that's another story. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here again. As Dan said, I have come both to the Graduate School of Education, to Penn University, and this is a great opportunity once again to talk about UNESCO and also to talk about some common agenda that I believe the organization that I led until 2 months ago has with this very prestigious university. I have come here the first time, once again invited by Dr. Wagner, because at that time I was speaking about literacy. I think it was 2010 or 11, very early on in my mandate. And since then we have nourished this partnership, this friendship, as he said, and I would like to say how much I appreciate him, how much I appreciate the contribution of you to this, I would say, general search for responses to some of the pressing questions around education, about sustainable development, and at the end of the day about peace. Now, I think we started actually this debate yesterday with a very successful launch of your book about learning and development, and I met many of you yesterday, and I would like to say that please read this book. Start with the preface because I signed it and then move on to the book itself, but to say how happy I was to modestly, very modestly support this so important project, which I think reflects the lifelong dedication to education. And this is almost like the story of UNESCO. But because you wanted me before that to say a few words about myself and about my involvement with this organization, let me just say that my personal history coming from Bulgaria and moving towards the international organization, maybe it's not that different than others, but I was in diplomacy, I was passionate about multiculturalism, about different cultures. As I shared during lunch, I wanted to become an archaeologist, to discover new civilizations. I was passionate about the other cultures. Then I moved in, I said, no, I will become a journalist, I will travel around the world and I will be doing the reporting. And I ended up becoming a diplomat. I was lucky to have a mother that was very supportive of me, and actually it was a typical example, I think, of many girls nowadays in communities that cannot ensure that all their daughters go to school. She was coming from a poor family before the war, a dropout after primary education, going to work and do other things. Then after the war, married with 2 children. She went to evening schools, finished her secondary education, went to the university, studied medicine, made a PhD, became a scientist, radiologist, and my recollection from my young years that with mother we were both studying. She was studying and I was studying, so it was a wonderful example, a role model indeed of what education can do and what kind of opportunities it can open. And since that time I have been thinking a lot. I have never taken education for granted. I have always had this example of my mother that education, you have to fight for education. You have to respect it. You have to cherish it, and you have really to find a way that education for you opens something very important in your life. And I think further on I have always very often come to this example in order to say what education means and how it is fundamental for human development, for rights, for dignity, and particularly I would say for girls and for women. So later when I was becoming a diplomat, I think the other eye-opener for me was that I was lucky enough, I studied Spanish in university. Maybe there are here students from Latin America. I was passionate about Latin America. I was thinking that Latin America is, it was the time of Allende, it was the time of kind of a renaissance of looking for different way of some countries through democratic ways to find their own dignity and their own development. And that's why I studied Spanish, I studied Latin America, and I thought all my life I will be dedicating also to Latin America. When I went to the foreign ministry, they said, no, you know too many languages, you go to the UN department. And I was very disappointed. I said, what I'm going to do in this UN department? They take something very precious from me and my passion, my young passion and belief. But then in the UN department, I went to work in the gender, in this part of the United Nations that was development and gender, and I was lucky enough to go to the United Nations conferences during the decade for the advancement of women in 1980 in Copenhagen, 85 Nairobi, and then later on already after the changes to Beijing, where a famous United Nations conference. And this was really an eye-opener. I went to all different debates which were about the legal frameworks, which were about stereotyping, which were about opportunities, economic, political leadership, and since then I decided really that United Nations can make a difference, that United Nations is not just about one decision of Security Council here or there, but they have a very direct impact on the lives of people. In this particular case, I got my understanding about gender equality from this period. And of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of Eastern Europe was a historic moment. And I was feeling that it is a moment where it may happen in your life or it may never happen. So it were a lucky generation, my generation, that we were still young enough in order to contribute to this democratic process. And I was offered to run for a parliament. And I was thinking, of course, I was not prepared. I mean, I never thought that I will be running for a parliament, that I will elected official. And at that time, the electoral system in Bulgaria was mixed. Then you stop me when I talk too much about my souvenirs, and early it's not good. I have to just stop me at some point. But I think it's important to encourage you also to run. Because the electoral system was mixed. This parliament was the Constituent National Assembly. It was just to elaborate the constitution, new democratic constitution, and then it dissolved. And there were mixed system. One were party lists and the other were majority votes. So because at that time I was not very prospective. I mean, I was put into the majority vote. If I get it, I get it. The people who are more kind of stable, they were in both party lists and in majority vote. So if they fail into the majority vote, then they will get through the party lists, which is a sure bet if you're in the first. And I was in a mixed region. Bulgaria has a Turkish minority, which is our history of the Ottoman Empire. And I was running in a predominantly Turkish Muslim region. And I went from house to house. I lived in with families. I liaised with a lot of women's groups and girls. And at the end of the day, I was elected by 60% of the vote in this region. And I was extremely proud of that. This gave me the opportunity to work for the new Bulgarian constitution. And particularly, I was focusing on the human rights. I wanted to work in the Commission on Human Rights. I worked on the Commission on Human Rights. I was, in fact, one of the co-authors of the text in the Constitution against the capital punishment, which was very important for us at those times, and on many of these related issues which are to be. So I'm very proud now to say that from that point of view, I was part of this new building of the nation and of the country. And then further on, when I became the first Secretary of State Secretary for European Integration, Relations with the European Union. I started negotiations with the European Union, and finally, of course, others continued, and Bulgaria joined the European Union. So far, and then I was not very much into party politics, so I said I'm not continuing this. At that time, the government offered me to come to Paris, to go to Paris to become bilateral ambassador of the country, an important period when I had to ensure the ratification of the accession treaty of Bulgaria. And I, of course, immediately jumped into UNESCO, and my husband said, you found your UN. Once again, whenever you go, you find your multilateral system. So then elections, I ran for elections, and I won them. There were 9 candidates during these elections. It was quite a tough competition, 5 rounds of elections, and at the end of the day, how I did it, it's a secret then, because it's, you know, it's a chess, a diplomatic chess, what you do, how you do, what you did, but the most important is that I did it. I was very proud, of course, of this. I didn't sleep nights. I was speaking and talking and thinking of what and how. And then I was re-elected in 2013. And here I am after 2 mandates, 2 terms of UNESCO. I stepped down in November. Now, why UNESCO? I think I always would have preferred to run for UNESCO than other posts in the United Nations, because although I was also one of the candidates for the Secretary General of the United Nations in 16,
candidate for many of us for UN Secretary
Yeah,
General.
it's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Or
Yeah.
didn't quite work.
Yeah, this time it didn't work. But you know, you run sometimes, but you don't lose. And I think in politics, if you run, you may not be elected, but either your ideas or the way you present your campaign and your ideas still is respected. And I think this is what happened, and I'm very much, I would say, at ease with myself. And I would say that Antonio Guterres is an excellent Secretary General, and he's a friend, a colleague. There were other very good candidates who still remained my friends with whom I work. And the most important, that it was a very open competition, a good competition. And of course, not everybody can win. So I don't have any regrets into this. But UNESCO, and I want to come now to UNESCO because I think this is very important. UNESCO is not just the biggest agency within the United Nations system when it comes to the scope of its action, its mandate. It's not the richest, maybe it's the poorest. But this is not the point. The point is that UNESCO is an intergovernmental agency, one of the first to be created after the Second World War. Already in 45, 72, 73 years later this year. And it was based on a totally different approach to building peace. Because at the end of the day, United Nations were created after the war to prevent another war of coming. And the main idea was how to prevent this to happen again, how to prevent these atrocities, this tragedy for humanity to happen again. And already during the Second World War in 1942, in London there was a first meeting of ministers of education of the Allied forces at the time, convened by Alan Wilkinson, the Minister of Education of Great Britain, when they decided that there should be an organization, international organization, that should promote international cooperation in education, because education is vital in order to uphold human rights, human dignity, but also to prevent war from happening. Because it is written in our Constitution, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And by the way, these words, as we say, were penned by MacLeish, the Librarian of Congress, at that time in 45. I just say this in order to emphasize that UNESCO is very much an American also institution, an American idea, an American ideal, maybe we could say, that found its expression in UNESCO after the Second World War. And I did mention this, and I really want to once again emphasize, I'm sorry to repeat for those who have heard me say this these days, that our Constitution is such a poetic, intellectual document of human rights, of human dignity, that it became the foundation for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Literally, if you compare the two, you will see phrases from our Constitution that later, in 48, were penned into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and adopted by the United Nations. And once again, I say this in order to say that it was not meant to be simply a technical agency, intergovernmental. It was meant to be a United Nations institution for peace, to bring peace, but in a different manner, not through military action, not through hard security decisions, as we say, but in a different manner, through the cooperation in the area of education, sciences, culture, and later on communications were added to our mandate. So if you look at the history of this great institution, I think that UNESCO should be proud of so many initiatives, ideas that were launched into the intellectual, I would say, thinking through congresses and conferences and brainstorming meetings of scientists, of intellectuals, of educators, and so many great ideas for humanity were launched by and through UNESCO. And I'm not speaking only about so many organizations, associations that were literally launched by UNESCO, and now they have their own life. The International Council of Museums, the International Association of Theaters. In the intellectual, the cultural and arts area, I think there is nothing, no one single institution or organization that did not stem, and I'm talking about multilateral, of course, that does not have its beginning from UNESCO. But other ideas that were launched also within UNESCO, let's say the idea about renewable energies were launched by UNESCO. The overall idea about sustainable development also was born in UNESCO. And then, of course, the evolution of this international cooperation in education, culture, and the sciences by itself, inside of its own sector, is a very interesting case in point. And here, of course, I will be speaking more about education, but just to mention a few, I would say, such big ideas that were launched within UNESCO in order to put it into a broader perspective of what this organization has brought to humanity. I'm just briefly and only mentioning the great idea about heritage, cultural heritage protection, because it was the very revolutionary idea to think that cultural site, a mosque, a church, a synagogue, a building, an old part of a town, of a city, or some other vestige may represent outstanding universal value. I think this is the greatness, the great idea that we all as humanity can unite behind the respect and protection of something that may belong to another culture, to another religion, but we all are connected. Why? Because the underlying criteria of the inscription of such a site on the World Heritage is its outstanding universal. I think this universal is the key to understanding why this World Heritage represents one of the greatest ideas I think that UNESCO has launched, and it serves nowadays as intercultural dialogue, mutual respect, and something that we want to see nowadays in a globalized world, that we say living together. And this is very much linked also to education and to the understanding of education today in the 21st century. But going back once again to these big ideas that UNESCO has been launching. If you take the concept of sustainable development, and if you look at the report of the first report on sustainable development that was commissioned and prepared at that time under the leadership of a Prime Minister of Norway at that time, Gro Harlem Brundtland, in the 70s, then later became a Director-General of the World Health Organization, and a very great, I would say, a politician, impressive woman politician also. In this report, education, the emphasis and the thinking about sustainable development was linked predominantly with environment. There is an explanation to this, of course. It was the revival, maybe for the first time, that humanity and United Nations started to think about environment and the protection of the environment as something that really is degrading, and you have to take some specific actions. But of course, nowadays we know that sustainability cannot be linked only to environment. And education at that time was just marginally, it was not at all, I would say, discussed, debated to the extent that we would have liked to see it at those times. So I just want to say that for a very long period of time, of course, UNESCO was having programs in education, but it was linked to literacy. UNESCO was and still is the lead agency in the area of literacy, and later on to primary education. And the idea that everybody should go to school actually did not exist to this large extent before the 90s, before the Jomtien meeting, before UNESCO started to think about how to mobilize the world around the idea that every child has to have a right to go to school, to schooling, to education. This did not exist. It was kind of accepted that, well, there will be those who go and those who not. For some countries, it is not possible because they are lagging behind. So this idea was born. There was a first conference in Thailand, in Jomtien, when this idea started to get some traction and to be formulated and to be studied. And I don't know, maybe Dan, you were in Jomtien at that time to this, you missed that. So anyway, this was the first, as we say, early bird that started, the lamp that started to say, well, education is important indeed for development. And along the decade, long from 90 to the year 90 to 2000, there was a lot of discussions and debates of the role of education and how really to mobilize the world around the education, and it was given the name of education for all. So when at that time the United Nations were adopting the Millennium Development Goals, which was a very different process than the Sustainable Development Goals, the 8 Millennium Development Goals, education found its place, and education for all, so to say, was formalized within these Millennium Development Goals. And it was a huge success, I think, for education. But if you look at what in the Millennium Development Goals it meant, it was about primary education. And that's it. Which is still was an advancement against the global understanding of education. But it was understood, and the global donor community and the others were thinking that education should be concentrated only on primary, that countries, that developing countries and others that are lagging behind should not invest in secondary education, let alone in higher education, because the most important was to have access to education and to get kids in school, which was still a progress. It was still a big progress. So Millennium Development Goal, and then UNESCO was very much mobilized around the Millennium Development Goal. It was the lead agency, and there were a lot of efforts to see how these Millennium Development Goals can be implemented. And this is where UNESCO started, I think 2004 or 5, the Global Monitoring Reports. And UNESCO started the Global Monitoring Reports with the aim of a more targeted approach towards the different sectors, and what are these challenges, actually, this huge education agenda, and how to go deeper into this thinking about what education represents for economy, for social inclusion, for peace, for sustainable development. And if you look at the evolution of these global monitoring reports with the statistical data and with some projects for the future, I think they give you a very good also understanding and perspective of how the evolution of thinking about education in its different specificity evolved during this time. And all this analysis and work that UNESCO has been doing brought us to the idea that it's a very limited approach. Having only primary education is so limited that it locks countries into the same vicious circle, actually, of poverty, of underdevelopment, and if you add on top of that the poor quality of education, a topic that came literally in the last, let's say, 5-6 years before the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, we saw that it is a reproduction of poverty of the same system. And this is where UNESCO started educating very loud, and it was, I would say, the only agency, with all my due respect to all the other actors in education, which otherwise are doing a great job. I'm speaking, of course, the World Bank, who is mobilizing resources, UNICEF, and of course their primary work is young children, so it's natural for them, and some others. UNESCO was the only to advocate for a holistic approach to education, precisely because our report on quality education showed that you have nowadays 250 million young people in the world who have been in formal education, some kind of formal education. The statistic shows and puts them into the line of educated people, but they're functionally illiterate because they have been gone through a very poor quality of education. So this was really an alarm that was ringing, an alarm bell that was ringing, that we have to change totally our approach towards education. Now, of course, education for all brought a huge progress, and we should not in any way denigrate this and deny this. If in the 90s there were more than 110 million children out of school, then they were decreased by half almost, and I think the tendency was quite positive. But then conflict in many parts of the world once again put this figure down, because we know that out of 58 or 60 million children, you know, this figure is changing. The majority of them are in conflict areas. More than 32, I think, the last statistic showed that 32 million children out of school are in the conflict areas. So then the attention was turned, of course, to the quality education. And we started preparing for the Sustainable Development Goal with lots of brainstorming and thinking around, and also looking at what actually brings quality to education, to look at the teachers, to look at the curricula, to look at the enabling environment, because quality education also should be looking at how these ecosystems, as we say, are conducive to a high quality of education. We started to be a little bit more targeted to girls' education, because we know that still only 38% of countries have parity in secondary education, and 60% in primary education. So still girls are lagging behind in both primary and secondary education. We started looking at new technology. The technological revolution in the meantime brought enormous opportunities to move forward the quality of education, but how to use these new technologies. We started looking at skills. We started talking about learning, and the book that you was so right in terms to speak about learning, because it's if you put education, yes, you go to education, to school, but learning is what matters, right? And maybe you know better than me that it's about learning and what makes the quality of learning nowadays. We started looking at skills, how you connect skills of young people with the world of work, and what kind of skills young people nowadays have. We started also to once again go back to our sources to say, well, education also is about peace. Education is about values. Education is about human rights. Education is about human dignity. And education is about some cultural competencies in a world that is globalized, that it is moving so fast nowadays, with migrations, with communication, with interaction, that you have to give new competencies to young people to cope with this diversity. And education is also about climate change. Education is about environment. We had a decade of education for sustainable development, of mobilizing educators around the world also to work for sustainable development through different, once again, teachers and curricular, and the way we also look at this. So when we brainstormed, and it was a very vibrant years of debates and interacting with universities, with researchers, with ministries, civil society, private sector also. And then the new concept emerged, which is education about global citizenship, which reflects also, in my view, something that is emerging nowadays in the world, in a globalized world, that we have to do so many different competencies, and young people, if they want really to be citizens, to be responsive citizens, to know their rights, but also to know the rights of the others and to respect them, and also to be competitive in a world that is competitive, and to give them all the different opportunities. And of course, to mobilize around financing for education, a big topic that this last year was debated. And different, there was a special commission. I was also one of the co-chairs of this special commission on financing for education, and to look at education in emergencies, of refugees, and what kind of a response we give to education, because in any case, when you go to a refugee camp or you visit a community, displaced community, and I have visited so many different parts of the world, or if you go to a place after a natural disaster and you ask families, one of the first things each one of them says, we want our kids to go again to school. And this is so vital, and we have been fighting for a long time, making advocacy, because education was a poor, I would say, kind of an orphan in emergency responses to such cases. Only 2% until recently of all the humanitarian aid in the world was going to education. Now it is slightly increased. The European Union, and I have been working a lot with European Union, they increased it to 4%. But our specialist experts know very well through our global monitoring reports that we need to have at least 8% of all the humanitarian aid if we want to give the right response and to ensure that children in these circumstances also go to school. So I'm mentioning all this history in order to show the value of an institution like UNESCO. And of course we work with partners. We have been working in all this, we have been working with the sister agencies and funds and programs. We have been working with UNICEF, with the World Bank, with UNDP. We have been working on technical vocational training with International Labour Organization. We have been working with institutions. We have been working with our great UNESCO chairs, and I think it is very important once again indeed to thank you, Dan, for this. But what is very important, and I would like to emphasize this, in all this process we should never forget something that I mentioned. We should never forget literacy. We should never forget lifelong learning, because and UNESCO is also one of the few, if not the only agency that has a responsibility into this. With the poor quality of education, we see that unfortunately this big army of illiterate people in the world is not reduced. Still we have 800 million almost, right? Illiterate people in the world. And I think this is a huge tragedy for the world, that we deprive these people of opportunities for further on for their own development in life. And unfortunately, the international community is not that much focused on this. It's not glorious. There is not much financing also for these programs. Sometimes it's difficult to convince that you have to finance programs of literacy in Afghanistan, for example, for women, where we have our biggest literacy program, or in some other instances. So I think what we have been doing all these years with the adoption of the Agenda 2030 nowadays, with the goal number 4, which speaks about equitable quality education and lifelong learning for all, it captures the, I would say, understanding of what education represents nowadays in the world. And the fact that we have put there, and it was not easy, by the way, to adopt it, the fact that we have put there compulsory primary and secondary education is a huge achievement, I would say, huge achievement for the world. It was not everybody agreed with that, because it means additional resources. It's complicated, but I think we did justice to humanity and to education by introducing this. And now I would say that more and more and more countries adopt a legislative framework. African countries are adopting more and more this framework, new laws, in order to make also secondary education compulsory. I think there is a much bigger understanding of why girls' education matters, maybe because also of some extremists that are preventing an attacks on girls and girls' education in the world. But what is important within the Agenda 2030, and what we have been trying to do, it is to put the link between education and the implementation and the importance of all the other 16 Sustainable Development Goals, to impart the understanding that education is the foundation of all the sustainable. Education brings sustainability to other goals. You cannot have success into the maternal health care or child mortality if mothers are illiterate or if they have only primary education. And there is plenty of statistics that show that sometimes child mortality is cut by half, or maternal health also is improving if mothers are having primary or even more when they have secondary education. Of course, if girls go to school, safe schools, they are not married off, they are not getting pregnant, early pregnancies decrease, and then they have much more chance further on to have their lives in their own hands. And then, on the other side, even for the developed world, if women have skills, educated, and also they're giving the opportunity to contribute to the economies of their countries, GDP grows. And in fact, all society benefits from that. It is not just women, but all societies, communities, and everybody has a benefit out of this. And countries where economies and growth is lagging behind have understood this. Take Japan with a new drive to include women into the workforce, or in some other countries to increase the skills of women and I would say the education, the quality of education of women, to include them into different positions of life is very important. I mention this to say that nowadays we are living in a world where education is broadly understood and supported as one of the prime responsibilities and priorities of many governments. I don't know of a single country, nowhere in the world, developed, a middle-income country or in development or least developed country, where the quality of education is not an issue nowadays, from different perspectives, a different level of course, but this is a high political priority. And I'm very happy that UNESCO could drive this understanding about education all these years. And now of course is the time to implement all this. Now, I know that you are a university with the long history, not just of working in the area of education, but very international, very pro-UN, very close to us, to UNESCO. And I just met a couple of you also talking about different projects that you have. I think now it's very important that we continue this thinking, this research on the different specific areas. The more we become, I would say, elaborate and knowledgeable about the different aspects of education and its impact on society, on community, the more I think we will be accompanying and helping communities and government to implement this sustainable development goal, which is vital for overall development. And I would really encourage you to continue working in the different areas of education. Of course, I know that many of you are familiar with UNESCO. Maybe I should have started with this, because the program that we started with you, Dan, of involving you in some of our offices, in some of our programs, of working on different areas, was a fantastic program, and we're extremely happy, our offices, with this. I hope this continues, because this is also a way of exchanging ideas and looking how we can make a synergy of your research, our work on the field, and our global leadership, so that we may really implement this goal number 4, equitable, quality, and lifelong education and lifelong learning for all. I stop here.
Okay. You stopped there, but now we start here. So
I was on time. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. I don't know how you do that, just right on the button. Lots of food for thought, historical dimensions, policy approaches, so many different issues. I think we just open the floor and see what transpires. So you can raise your hands, identify yourself, and here we go. So please.
So yesterday as well.
My name is.
So that everybody hears.
Right. I'm Ujwala. I'm from Nepal. Yesterday at the book launch, both of you were talking about how it is important the teacher training aspect is important, and especially to have female teachers for to encourage girl education. I was also wondering what efforts have been taken to encourage women leadership in like administrative position. Like it's not just, I feel like it's not just important to have female teachers, but also like female principals, and so what kind of efforts have been taken into that at that kind of encouragement of women to take on leadership roles in education?
This is a, yeah.
So I'd like you to, I can repeat the question, or you
No, no,
can
I-
the microphone, just so they,
okay.
Teacher training, leadership roles.
Women teachers, women principals. Right, yeah. Well, the question about, we mentioned this yesterday within the context of what are those steps, what are those measures that will make girls' education possible, if I may just remind yesterday what was the context. And I was saying that in some environments, of course one size does not fit all, but there are environments where teacher's profession is totally feminized. I mean, take Europe. But there are environments where it's not at all. And if in communities, if you want to take to make girls go to school, to convince families, it's rather to have women teachers, which also serve as a role model, which is a very good, in my view, way of convincing girls to go to school and convincing, of course, parents. The question about principles, it's interestingly enough, came to UNESCO very late. And it was literally now that we are starting speaking about principles. In fact, it was maybe some 4 or 5 years ago. We established a partnership with the One Foundation, which was called the 10,000 Principles. The idea was to train principals and then they to go and train others to replicate a little bit this. So it was just the beginning, I think, of this thinking about the role of principals, because we were very much focusing not on administration, how you administer, we were really focusing on teachers, ministries, and all this. So it's a newcomer, I think, to this debate. But I think it's an important debate, and I hope they continue working on this because it has been a little bit outside the context.
Hi, my name is Amrit. I'm a lecturer at IEDP program here at Kent. So 2 questions. One regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, right? So when there are political changes in big governments like US, and the whole UNESCO and UN is moving towards the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm curious to see what kind of thinking, discussions, strategies leadership level at UNESCO, like how to move forward and what kind of things would happen. So that's question 1. Question 2 is about sustainable development goals, and particularly on number 4, education. A lot of people think that there should be benchmarking to find out that whether countries are progressing or not. Because it happened like Millennium Development Goals also. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on whether there should be benchmarking for number 4, education. If so, how should that look like? How would we do that?
Well, the first question, I would like to respond the following way. Agenda 2030 is very different from the Millennium Development Goals. And what makes different, in my view, apart from the fact that it's universal, it's not just for the developing world, it's for the North, for the South, for everybody. So it's really a collective thinking about humanity, about the planet, about us, where we are going. And everybody is there. Everybody can find something to change, to aspire to, and to move forward. Not a single country has responded to all these 17 development goals, even the United States. maybe some of the Nordic countries, but even they have problems, and they're setting also their own goals. The second is exactly this, that it is owned by countries. This is not an agenda that somebody has imposed on the countries. The Millennium Development Goals was a little bit imposed. It was at that time Secretary-General Kofi Annan who worked with a team of experts and then agencies like UNESCO and this, and they said this resolution, these are the Millennium Development Goals. They were a little bit into the realm of aspiration. We adopt and that's it. This time it's different. This time countries, governments were sitting together and they adopted this. It's there. It's not UN. It's theirs. So it is not that the UN will, governments and countries will implement these goals. So, of course, there are those who are the least developed countries and those who struggle with it, do not have capacity, do not have financing. And this sustainable development and what we also are doing, we are really helping these countries, mostly focusing on the least developed, to find a way to implement the SDGs. Capacity building or financing or all different kind of things. Of course the middle income countries also need support, but it's more on the technical level support. Many countries have resources. The question here is how they leverage these resources for development, how they budget their education. We plead for more resources to education. Between 4 and 6% of budget should go to education. So it's not just a matter and there is no money. It's a matter of how you spend this money and how you put your priorities. My point is here that what we are doing and the United Nations is doing, and in this particular case UNESCO, is to, and there is a process of national reporting, is about holding governments accountable to what they're doing to implement these goals and to have a peer review. And what is happening in the Economic and Social Council in New York, which is the prime, so to say, venue of monitoring the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about reporting. So countries go and they make their national reports, and it's a peer review. So they report to each other, so to say. They hold each other accountable. And I think this is a very important a way of implementing and of monitoring the implementation, because we don't have the means to coerce government to do something. But when they're going in front of everybody else, and now there is kind of a noble competition among some of them. Many of them have adopted already the SDGs and their national policies. Colombia was the first country to adopt the SDGs, even they were not even approved by the General Assembly, to incorporate in their national policies. Many countries have created governments, ministries for sustainable development to coordinate all these activities. So the role of the United Nations and us was to encourage them, to support them in their own. This is how development comes from inside and is sustainable. And I think this is very important to understand. What was your second question?
About benchmarking.
The benchmarking, yes. Well, this is the indicators. Now we have the targets, out of the 17, there are 169, and in education we have 6 targets, and the indicators, some are easier to make these indicators, and we're working precisely on these indicators. Some are a little bit more difficult, but indicators are important. This is where our Institute of Statistics and the Global Monitoring Team and others are working precisely on these indicators. Some of them, as I said, can have, as a result, some kind of a more precise indicators. Some are more into the realms of, global citizenship education, for example, is very difficult to quantify. But if you put it into the context of education for sustainable development, now there is a very vibrant discussion in very many different research institutions and NGOs and others on what this global citizenship education. So I think at the end of the day, something more concrete will emerge.
My name is Giovanna. I'm from Paraguay. And my question is, what would you advise women that are interested in working at multilateral organizations that are mostly dominated by men? So what would you advise women? How should they navigate that context?
Well, you have to apply. Just apply and go through it, and don't be afraid of the process, of recruitment and all this. I think I have appointed many women in my organization, very competent, good women at different levels, and I think you just have to believe in yourself and to just apply.
If I can ask, how was it? Because I remember when you applied to be Secretary General of the United Nations, there was a moment in which somebody they said, this is the time we must have a woman as Secretary General. And in that context, it was said we must have Irina Bokova.
Well, there were such voices. There were such good voices,
They were the best voices. They were my voice. There were a lot of our voices. But so, sort of, I don't know if you can hear me, but sort of talking about chessboards and thinking about international politics. How did it turn out that the voice of women in that particular, which is kind of related, to be Secretary General quite yet, but still.
But why not?
Why not? I want to know. Are there any insights from that process of when they found out that a woman should be Secretary General, but it didn't quite happen? Is there a public story that can be told about that?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think there was this campaign. These elections were very much, on the one side they were the same. You know how it is. It's Security Council voting and then going to the General Assembly. So it's a little bit quite a closed door negotiations and all according to the United Nations Charter. And there is, of course, a lot of push to change this because, it has to be more transparent and this and that. Still, there was a step forward. The General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution on its role into the elections. There were hearings that were held with each candidate for 2 hours. There was a big coalition of NGOs, 147 billion. They say this is such an important post. It is not just for government. Civil society has to participate. They invited many of the candidates to participate in open discussions. There was a lot of movement, and then of course there was this campaign of Woman for the Secretary General, which was led by Jean Krasno from Yale University professor, Gideon Sorensen, the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and Shazia Rafi from Parliamentarians for Global Action. Now, I think at the end of the day, it's a political process. There were almost half women and men candidates, and it was a political process. And when I heard one of the P5, the permanent member of the Security Council ambassador, saying at the question of would his country vote for a woman Secretary General, and he said that it is not that important that it is a woman, but it is important to elect a feminist as a Secretary General. At this moment I understood that it's over, that it won't be a woman, that it may be a feminist, a man, like Antonio Guterres. He's appointing a lot of women and he's a good Secretary General, I want to emphasize this. But still the thinking was not very much around it. I think this campaign, the Woman for Secretary General, are drawing their own lessons of this campaign. I think they were putting a lot of emphasis only on the woman side and not that much on the competencies, on the women that can really have the job because they're competent. So and this kind of had a backlash, and they say, oh, why should it be woman? We want to elect somebody competent. So I think this was here a little bit of a weakness of this camp, and they recognize it. But what is most important, I think that the next, I hope, will be a woman Secretary General, because there is a momentum being built. There was a lot of disappointment, backlash from that point of view, not because Antonio Guterres is bad, but just the very feeling that it's high time to have a woman. So I think now this cannot be stopped anymore. Of course, the P5 countries, the permanent members of Security Council, they have their political and other negotiations, but I think next time they will really look for a woman, because the global outcry against the background of what I see nowadays as a drive also for women equality and for once again supported by men strongly, because it's not just a matter of women. When we speak about gender, it's so I think I'm hopeful that at least we women that participated in this campaign have opened the door, so after us there will be, at the end of the day, somebody who will be there.
Can I follow it? I realize there are other questions here, but I'd like to follow on this just with a question. So when this campaign was started, I was part of various conversations very informally with people, and when people were name and the other women were running, they said, this is the time where we need dialogue. And women know how to dialogue more effectively than men know how to dialogue. I realize that's a bit of a stereotype. Amongst people we talk with, so that is something that is understood, that maybe men aren't as good at dialoguing, and maybe that is one of the problems of the United Nations. Do you have any, or do you think about gender difference as something that doesn't really enter into diplomacy, or do you think it could enter into diplomacy?
I have heard such an argument. It has not come at all during this campaign. And, well, to be frank, I have found men who can dialogue also. Men also are good sometimes. But I think there are two issues here, and it's subtle, you know, and you know it maybe by yourselves. And whenever it comes to, I think one of the problems with this campaign was that the world is very complicated nowadays. We are in a kind of a transition, right? Geopolitical. It's shifting powers. It's some people say it's multipolar. Others say it's apolar. No leadership. You know, new emerging countries are coming to the stage, but they're not exactly have the same power. So it's people say whether it's a world order or they speak about world disorder. I was recently in a conference. Well, it was about the world in brackets this and then order. So when it comes to such circumstances, I think the stereotyping is that whether women or people ask themselves, can a woman manage such a complex situation when you have to take, you know, hard decisions, security, military? It is always, you know, related to this type of competencies. And I still remember, I was young at that time, but I remember the words of, you know, there was Geraldine Ferraro, the candidate for vice presidency of the United States, the first woman candidate. I was a young diplomat at that time, and I was at the United Nations meeting, and I was listening to the debate. It was in the 80-something, I think, and they asked her a question. Well, if she becomes a vice president and something happens with the president and she becomes a commander in force, she has not been in the army. Can she be a chief, you know, how is it, commander? Yeah, commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States? And she responded and she said, look, you do not have to be colored, a person of color, or, you know, in order to fight racial discrimination. And I think that was a perfect answer to this question. You do not necessarily have to be, you know, a man to be tough or to be in the army in order to know what security is, or to fight racial discrimination or, I don't know, xenophobia against somebody from another culture, and you're not from that, because your value system, so to say, is what matters in this particular case. So I think this played also a role, that the world is too complicated. Maybe wrong, but I think
Actually, I think advantage in this area that is multicultural, and that the problems we're facing are largely especially social, and often are not tuned in sufficiently. So I would turn it completely opposite, but
it's a pity you didn't vote. What a loss for
he
the...
asked me to vote. Okay, so
anyway.
Introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sharon Wolf. I'm a faculty here at the School of Education. I had a few questions, but you ended up touching on a lot of them and the different things you said. So the one thing I'll ask is, we talked about an enabling environment and a kind of ecosystem for quality education to actually be fulfilled. And I was hoping you could try to actually flesh that out a little bit. And I think your book, Dan, touches on, that's really what it's about, how to create an ecosystem of learning in and out of school, issues of language. But kind of from all the work you've done and from the position you've been in, what do you see as kind of the key things to think about, the key ecosystems to create quality education and learning?
Well, I think all of this, at the end of the day, of course, in different communities, different circumstances, some things are more important than the others. But if you don't have a community or a family that encourages learning, it's obvious that, and it's particularly for girls, but not only, it is obvious that at the end of the day you will not have good results, particularly for girls, if you don't have also the support of a community leader or a religious leader. In many of these circumstances, this is very important. Then once again you will not achieve it. Or something that we spoke, and I know it's in the book, the matter of of language. If you speak a language you don't understand, and Asiatu was exactly this example yesterday with the launch of the book. I mean, you go there, they speak to you in something, or you learn there, you go home. It's very different. So all this, particularly for girls, it's of course broader. It's about safe schools. It's about a lot more of circumstances that are needed in order to do it. So I think indeed for learning, and that's why societies and countries where education has become a value, high value, have advanced enormously. I mean, take Korea, the obvious example, the Republic of Korea, where during the war, after the Second World War and all the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, Korea was one of the poorest countries. They had something more than 80% illiteracy. And they put enormous effort on education. Education became and still is one of the prime values in a family and in the society. So now even they say that there is a lot of stress and tension, and they try a little bit to kind of alleviate and to make it, to lower the tension around outcomes and success in education in this, but it became a prime value. And this is, and everybody knows that this is the way Korea became from a poor country, cutting edge nowadays in technology, and from a recipient became an aid donor, and a very, very highly competitive and successful society and country. So when it becomes a value, education, for a community, for society, for families, this is very important. So this encourages indeed the whole of society to learn, to achieve, and I think this is very important.
Hi, I'm Erin. I graduated from the IEDP program last year, and you mentioned how literacy, though integral to educational success, doesn't necessarily get the same sort of funding as other topics in today's field. And I wanted to know what your opinions are, what you think would be perhaps necessary actions taken either by UNESCO or other actors in the field of kind of putting the fire underneath that topic to make it more of a priority than it might seem today.
Well, literacy is not sexy because it's, no, indeed, because it's not about, children and this. It's about young people predominantly, or elderly people who are there. I think we need a lot more of advocacy around it. We need political leaders to speak about it, because what political leaders say is very important in the countries. And also, I think we have to show some good stories of why literacy has moved communities, ahead. We had a program of and we have many such programs, but one such, which was, by the way, linked with the Procter & Gamble, to give second chance to girls, young women already, to drop out, to integrate into a learning, and then also to give them some skills to start, small businesses or something like that. It was in Senegal, outside Dakar, and I went to visit this school. And what is very interesting is that because we did work a lot with the local community leaders, with the religious leaders, with the community leaders, and there were a lot of good stories to say of how these women, one started a small, business, opened a shop, another was doing something, weaving, something else, and they also kind of convinced the community leaders, were proud themselves that they did that. It was not UNESCO, that did that, but they could, give this opportunity to these women and to families to have a different status and to have income, and to become different members of their community. So you need this type of leadership, be it at the local level or at the high level. At least this is my experience in order to make this happen. But in every single case, I think the mistake until now, partly, was that literacy was not linked to skills. Literacy was a little bit detached from skills. And when you put literacy and then you add skills to this, it becomes then something that is valuable. And increasingly in our programs and work and others, skills are added to such literacy programs, and then all of a sudden people feel that, so at the end of the day something happens. It is not just personal gratification that somebody knows how to write and read, but there are outcomes which go beyond this. So I think it's very important to add skills to literacy.
And we've had many conversations about that.
Yes.
My name is Tarek, I'm from Pakistan. I was thinking about, within 1945, it was with a particular historical context where World War II just finished, and it was something that big for nations to actually decide to get together. More recently, geopolitical is such that it's moved from the global to the national to the tribal in this country, or Europe, and other places. On the other hand, the United Nations always had a very global sort of mandate, given very global messages, global development goals. And how do you feel, what's the interplay between that? How does United Nations still stay relevant in a world that's fragmenting in such a fast pace?
This is a very good question. Yeah. You touched really the one of the most, I would say, how to put it, and to be relevant, I think on one side, precisely because the world is fragmented, you need these global platforms. Of course, it's not like 45, as you said. At that time, it was after the war. There were the winners, the losers. Then the Cold War started. Unfortunately, kind of it was, this balance of power at some point, and it was more or less you knew what was going to happen in the UN, right? Because you go to this, you go to there. It was. But the complexity of the UN and its real challenge and relevance became exactly, and it is nowadays, in order to respond to a world which is kind of a disarray, chaotic, different tendencies. But I think at the same time, we all have to recognize that the biggest challenges of this world are global. They do not know national borders. I mean, take climate change, biodiversity, natural disasters, you name it. And all this, they do not know borders. It doesn't stop on the border with Pakistan and then you go to India. It doesn't stop here and then you go to Canada. So this puts us into a situation, as we say, we are in the age of limits. There are limits of this planet on which we are all living. There are limits as to what we can do. And we look for new ways, of new sources of energy, of growth, of inclusion, and here is where the development of the human mind, the human capital, is something that we call, and I have called many times, the ultimate renewable energy. And this is for everybody, for every country. So I think from that point of view, the UN is these multilateral platforms are simply indispensable if we want to survive as a humanity. And of course, with all the complexity, you're right, it's fragmented. It's two tendencies which are, it's paradoxical, it's schizophrenic sometimes. On one side, we are so much connected, we know what happens on the other part of the world. And we are either curious, or we suffer, or we have empathy, we are kind of connected. And at the same time, we are fragmented in our small communities, and I think precisely because of that, maybe because we are maybe not prepared for this rapid change, or some communities and some people are not prepared for this change. There are a lot of fear of change, and this fear brings about all these, political, xenophobic, and you name it, feelings and decisions, and that emerge there. So I think there is an enormous work to be done in terms of reconcile these differences. To reconcile, I mean to recognize, to respect, to make this one kind of living together, as we say, and to respond to these fears. And sometimes, I don't blame some communities because they just have never been exposed to this type of pressure or something, but there is a lot of work to be done, and politicians play a hugely important role into this. What they say, how they say it, the leadership of this, I think is vital in this very challenging world. But as I say, the challenges are really global. They asked me yesterday, I was talking, there was a video dialogue with Bill. We made it in Perry World House, and he was saying, what is your worry for the next 20 years? And I said, of course, it's climate change, because we all know that it's something that is around us and looming, and there it is no matter whether you're American, Bulgarian, Pakistani, Indian, Nigerian, Haitian, or whatever. It touches all of us. So we need some platforms where to discuss these issues. And this is, at the end of the day, United Nations.
Okay, so one last question here, then I'm going to do the last question, and this will be it.
Oh, we haven't given the floor. Maybe you said that you will be speaking also.
No.
At the end. No, because I'm speaking
I'm going to be honoring you at the end. I wouldn't call that a speech. Okay. It will be shorter than my introduction.
Yeah.
Claire, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Claire, and I'm American. And I'm wondering, you've touched a little bit on the role of teachers in improving the quality of education, but a lot of the projects that at least I've seen that are maybe bilateral or multinational or national projects that are trying to improve education really come at it from a place of maybe mistrust of teachers, or maybe coupled with an understanding that the investment that happens in terms of investing in teacher quality is low enough that there's not a lot that can be done in a short time, and there's a lot of effort to maybe circumvent teachers or approach training teachers in a way that's focused on efficiency and not investment in them as people. And I wonder what can be done or what has been done to encourage maybe more investment in teachers and the kind of human side that takes place in the classroom and between teachers and students, which I think is a really powerful element of education.
Yeah. Well, I think this is indeed key to to quality education, and it's not by chance that teacher qualifications and supporting teachers in training is one of the targets of this Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Now, I think I agree with you that teaching profession has been, how to put it, a little bit put aside in terms of support, respect, and I don't know exactly how is it here, although recently I spoke with the president of the union, one of the big unions of teachers here in the United States, because we work with the Education International. This is the big international trade union organization that has more than 40 million members of all over the world of teachers. I was in Brussels. They celebrated 25th anniversary, and the president of the union of one of the unions of American teachers was there. But it's not only about the US. I think it's a global phenomenon that teaching profession is not supported sufficiently. It is not remunerated sufficiently. There is not much investment in training, and overall the place of teacher is a little bit sidelined. And also because there was a moment, I think now we have a little bit tried to reverse this tendency, kind of a blind belief that new technologies will substitute the teacher. And new technologies are fantastic tool of knowledge, of literacy, of communicating, of training even of teachers and students and others. But I do believe that teachers have to be supported, because teachers are the empathy, the human side of teaching is so important for the development of a child. And there are so many psychologists and others who are speaking about, cognitive roles and how you achieve this and that. And it is about teachers, and let alone speaking about values, something that we spoke about. So how you, in fact, educate, impart these values into a child. It is by transmission, by human transmission, the values of rights, of respect, of working and living in a community, and with all the environment and all this. So we at UNESCO are very much focusing on teachers. There is a recommendation about the role of teachers that was adopted more than 50 years ago. It is adopted by International Labour Organization and UNESCO, and we celebrated it 2 years ago. We tried to develop a lot more respect for teachers, but I agree with you that it is still, so to say, one of the weak points of quality education and education systems. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm reserving the last question for myself. And my question is, what can people like this do to help UNESCO and the United Nations? I'm referring largely to the students here. There are a few faculty. But what is your view on this? And I mean Penn, but I also mean universities in general. So whatever your thoughts are, that the role that graduates of universities, whether they're in master's or doctoral programs or undergraduate programs, how does it look from the position of the DG of UNESCO, Director-General of UNESCO? When you see these, how do we utilize, reinforce, engage? Thoughts for encouragement?
Well, I think that there is so much, it's such a big space of still thinking and trying to find the right answers and analyzing it, and take the issue of indicators and how you actually benchmark and what to do. It's a huge area where we need research, we need a lot of thinking around it. The question about quality, what makes quality of education, is still something that needs a lot more of research, right? We did some years ago with Brookings, and I think with Brookings and the World Bank and UNICEF, our Institute of Statistics, to what actually makes the quality of education at the primary level, reading and this and that. But this is a huge area of research. What is the impact and how to use new technologies in education is another huge area still, and what is the impact of this. We speak about MOOCs. now everybody speaks about the new generation of MOOCs, that there is a need to make a new generation of MOOCs, a new way of using new technologies, and I think all this needs a lot of research, or multilingualism, and the quality of education, and how you work with mother tongue, and that we discussed previously today. So it's a vast area of research, and still questions. We don't have all the answers, and many education systems also are struggling of how to respond to some of these questions. How you train teachers nowadays in order for them to be adequate and relevant, and it's not about just information. What kind of interaction also with children? What is the classroom for the 21st century? It's not just to memorize a book, right? But so all this, it's a vast area of research, and I know that you are working on some of these, be it in the PhD program or others. So I think the contribution will be enormous if you continue just to work on this. And it is not just UNESCO, it's the wider, I would say, education community that needs this type of research and sharing and continuing brainstorming of what and how.
So those wise words are I'm sure well received. I think it's so important for us, whether we're undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, it's so important to hear those words. Sometimes it can be discouraging when you read the newspapers about, you know, the difficulty, the fractional nature of the world, and some of our politicians who say things that we find don't bring us together. So I think it's fantastic that you were able to share these days with us. This is Madame Bokova's last day. She leaves early tomorrow morning, and we're very privileged to have her here a whole day in education. So we thank you very much for joining us. We're going to thank you in just a second, but I also want to try to do a picture for those who wish to do almost immediately afterwards. She has a bit of a tight schedule, but you can stay around for a few minutes if you haven't already said who you are and had a handshake or whatever. So let's give a big Philadelphia UPenn IEDP applause.
Thank you to you.